Welcome to Life Finds a Way, the original diversity initiative. This week, Syris Valentine writes about what happens when you try to wall out migration, a biological imperative that species from salmon to jaguars to humans rely on for survival. Please enjoy Where the Wild Things Are Walled Out. Every winter, hundreds of bald eagles gather on the northeast arm of Lake Coeur d'Alene in the Idaho Panhandle to gorge on a mobile buffet of parading salmon as they return to spawn. Witnessing those birds of prey flock, surf thermals, plunge towards the lake, rip Chinook salmon from the water, and glide into the branches of a ponderosa pine feels almost sacred, even with the stench of fouling fish rising from the banks to suffuse the air. Anytime I've had the privilege of visiting Higgins Point, the lakeside vantage where wildlife lovers congregate to admire the event, I feel bathed in reverence for weeks afterward. Part of that hallowedness owes to the fact that both salmon and eagle traverse hundreds, if not thousands of miles to converge at the lake. While the bald eagles confront few difficulties as they cross the US-Canada border twice on their way from Alaska through British Columbia and either across Alberta or Washington, the Chinook face more notable challenges. Navigating the many dams that channel energy from the Spokane and Columbia rivers into which their destination lake flows. Most of those dams have been outfitted with salmon ladders to ensure that at least some of the fish survive the run to spawn. Yet dams like those faced by the Coeur d'Alene Chinook have nonetheless inflicted lasting damage on salmon populations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Because of their harms, the region's river plugs have long been the object of campaigns by conservationists, environmental activists, and Indigenous peoples. But salmon are far from the only animals that run up against barriers as they migrate. A growing array of species are having their movements impeded by an ecological threat proliferating around the world: border walls. The steel pillars lining the U.S. border with Mexico is perhaps the most nefarious example. If judged by its stated objective to keep people out, seeking the same liberties and opportunities that have attracted people to America since it was still a British colony, the Southern Wall is a failure and a disastrous waste of taxpayer dollars. You can't help but see how futile it is when you're down at the wall and you watch someone throw a rope and climb over it, said Eamon Harity, the wildlife program manager at the nonprofit Sky Island Alliance. Border Control will officially tell you that the wall buys them 10 to 15 minutes, because that's how long it takes someone to get over it. They don't even say the wall stops people. But as Harity has learned through his work leading the organization's studies into the wall's impact on wildlife, that it is incredibly effective at blocking animals. From August 2022 to July 2024, Sky Island Alliance maintained a network of 36 camera traps surveilling a section of the steel barrier separating Arizona from Sonora, Mexico, to study how wildlife reacted to the wall when they encountered it. In late 2024, they published a paper detailing what the cameras saw. Of more than 9,000 animals that their camera traps spotted in the vicinity of the barrier on the border of Arizona and Sonora, fewer than 2,000 were seen successfully crossing the border. Most of those were smaller species like foxes, bobcats, and coyotes. But larger animals like black bears, mule deer, white-tailed deer, and wild turkey never managed to make their way through. Mountain lions also struggled to cross the wall, with only a few smaller females managing to wriggle through some of the small wildlife passages that have been occasionally cut into the wall. The camera traps never captured video of the most iconic animal affected by Arizona's wall, the jaguar, but what they saw makes it quite clear that those big cats would never be able to cross. Whatever the animal, migration is essential to survival. It's how populations acquire the resources they need, avoid genetic bottlenecks, and steer clear of known dangers. Animals need to move to find water, to find food, to find a place to sleep, to find a mate, to reproduce, Harity said. Some animals move just a couple of inches in their life. Some move hundreds of kilometers a year. Some move tens of thousands of kilometers a year. The bigger the animal, the more they tend to move. Jaguars, the biggest cats found across the Americas, roam wide ranges. One 2016 study showed that a single male jaguar will migrate across a territory that can span 55 square miles up to 180 square miles, or, in rare cases, even more. Naturally then, the species spreads far to support a large population. When they were their most dominant, jaguars could be found anywhere from northern Argentina to the southern United States. They still today occupy most of that ancestral range, except for local extinctions within the borders of Uruguay, El Salvador, and, until recently, the United States. 4 decades after hunters rifled down the last jaguar in the American Southwest in 1963, a few cats were spotted in Arizona after making the border crossing before a wall was planned for that line in the sand. But as Trump's Department of Homeland Security drives yet more piles into fresh-poured concrete to erect pillar after pillar of 30-foot steel, the jaguar's return is at risk. One of the highest priority areas for Trump's latest border plans bisects Arizona's San Rafael Valley, a grassland bowl flanked by the Huachuca Mountains to the east and the Patagonia Mountains to the west. Eric Mesa, the Borderlands program coordinator for the Sierra Club's Arizona chapter, called the valley one of the best-kept secrets in Arizona. It's a very unique ecosystem, Mesa said. If you're there and you look around, it's not going to look a lot like what people's idea of Arizona is. Beyond the valley's own startling differences from its surroundings, the sky islands it sits between, isolated mountain ranges that seem suddenly jet from the desert floor, themselves offer sights uncommon in Arizona. You can be in the low desert and go to the top of a mountain in a 1-hour drive, he said, and then all of a sudden, it's like you were in Canada. The uniqueness of the San Rafael Valley makes it a hotspot for biodiversity, as well as a wildlife corridor, a natural highway for highly migratory species like jaguars and black bears. In fact, it's one of the only areas left on the continent where those two apex predators may encounter each other. But ongoing construction of a fresh segment of border wall through the valley will mean that the bears can no longer reach the southern extent of their range in Sonora, where they are endangered, and the jaguars can no longer reach the northern extent of their range, where they're equally endangered. The Trump administration is not concerned with further jeopardizing the survival of local populations of either species on either side of the border, nor does it seem to be concerned with the actual security of the border in the valley. Both Mesa and Harity say that the human crossings in the San Rafael Valley are rare, if they happen at all, because it's difficult to access and lies far from highways on Mexico's side of the frontier. Given the ease with which committed migrants and border coyotes can get around, over, or through the wall with ropes, ladders, buzzsaws, or torches, there's little reason for them to venture into the valley. But the Department of Homeland Security is demolishing a wide stretch of that unique ecosystem even as I write this. And on either end of the valley, the destruction will prove to be, in a very raw sense of the word, epic. Some of those areas are so remote and the terrain is so rough, Mesa said, they're going to have to use a ton of dynamite. You basically have to cut a mountain down to put a wall there, said Harity. And there's no shame in this, Mesa added. This is something they're actually proud of. Border Patrol has gone so far as posting multiple videos to social media glamorizing the destruction of public lands and national monuments. But the fact that this segment of the wall cuts right through what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has designated as critical habitat for jaguars is of little concern to a Homeland Security Department empowered by Section 102 of the 2005 Real ID Act to disregard all federal environmental regulations in its pursuit of building border barriers. Erecting walls along map-drawn lines that interrupt wildlife habitat while doing little to impede migrant crossing is not a problem restricted to the U.S. Since the terror attacks of 9/11, border wall construction has proliferated around the world, with around 19,000 miles worth of walls across Europe and Asia alone. This is having a predictably devastating impact on wildlife across the continent. Among other impacts, as Slovenia installs hundreds of kilometers of razor wire along its border with Croatia, wolves from the Central European region could be driven to extinction. Animals don't know the concept of borders, Mesa said. For them, it's all one shared landscape, driven by resources. As climate change shifts the way resources are distributed, where water can be found, where herbivores can find plants to eat, where predators can find prey, and where temperatures are tolerable, animals will be driven to migrate even further than normal. Border walls could mean they can't reach new habitats that will ensure their survival. In this fast-changing world, humans can learn something from the geopolitical ignorance of wildlife. For them, freedom of movement is natural. They don't even need to think about it. Elephants will just march through hotels erected in the middle of migratory paths that their matriarchs have guided them across for generations. We, too, have long understood the fundamental importance of movement to the human and animal spirit. A dozen nations in Europe have gone so far as to legally protect some version of a right to roam. In a paper published early last year, Noah Smith-Drelig, an assistant professor of law at Illinois Institute of Technology, trace the history of free movement through the legal traditions of England and America from the 1215 Magna Carta to the present day, to show that it's been a right seen as so fundamental that the nation's founders hardly felt the need to spell it explicitly in the Constitution. In fact, restrictions on immigration, Smith-Drellick said, actually comes up in the Declaration of Independence. This idea of the open road, of being able to go where you want, he said. There's something quintessentially American about that. It's hard to imagine beatniks like Jack Kerouac without that American impulse to take to highways and travel across the vast tracts that comprise this country. But even before American colonies were established, before the Magna Carta was directed, uninhibited movement was central to the evolution of the human animal and of human civilizations. Even just a cursory glance at a map of native lands occupied by the First Nations of North America shows that in the past, borders were far more permeable than we understand them to be today. And as the climate crisis continues to disrupt weather patterns, induce drought and deluge, drive infernos and famines, and stir up economic and political instability around the world, it will become increasingly imperative for every nation around the world to take a look at how we think about borders, immigration, and international aid. The communities that straddle the borderlands understand this just as well as the wildlife does, that these cartographic artifacts have no basis in reality. When you talk to folks who live and work along the border, Harity said, there are relationships that span the border. Ranchers in Arizona, he said, often have the cell phone numbers of their Sonoran neighbors, and when the occasional cow wanders too far north or south and unknowingly finds itself suddenly in another country, the ranchers will call each other up and get the cattle back where they're meant to be. It's just this line, and people know that they're just people, and they've existed and collaborated for generations. The trouble is getting others with no experience of realities at the border to understand that. There's a little bit of a truism tossed around down here, said Harity. The farther away from the border you are, the scarier it is. Lessening the fear of the border and of immigrants and foreigners is a critical step to finding ways to promote the freedom of movement that human beings deserve, a right enshrined in Article 13 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This fight for human rights and the rights of all life may seem somewhere between utopian and too far distant to matter in a moment of national and international crisis. But the fate of border walls and the way wealthy nations respond to increasing immigration will ultimately determine how many people and how many animals die and how many survive, whether salmon confronting dams, jaguars running into walls, or refugees jumping borders in the face of mounting pressures of climate change.